Hi, this is Ron Gilbert, and you're listening to the Scene World podcast.
Hey y'all, welcome to the podcast. I'm AJ. Joerg is right there. How's it going?
Hi everybody!
That means that this is the Scene World podcast.
Did you miss us as much as we missed you?
In a minute, we will be on here with Steve Salevan. He is one of the developers of the Neohabitat project, which is bringing back the granddaddy of the MMORPG thing.
So you will notice a role change here.
Yes, this is one of the...
AJ is doing all the questions and I'm asking the stupid ones, unprepared, knowing nothing about the topic.
This is one of the few podcasts in which I know what's going on more than Joerg does, because this was a uniquely... Most things that happen in the 64 scene, or that have happened in the 64 scene, are kind of Eurocentric, because it was really big in Europe, and then we sort of got the hand-me-downs here in the US. But Habitat was a thing that happened pretty much exclusively in the US and Canada, and not many Europeans know anything about it. So it's pretty nifty. It's part of the whole Q-Link thing that I was on for a short time back in the early 90s. Never played Habitat, though. I played the bastardized version of it, Club Carib, which was, I guess they decided that Habitat itself was too confusing for people because it was too big. And I've got a map. I downloaded a map of it, and it's massive. It's way bigger than I thought it was. And so they got rid of everything except like the beach section, and then they just repackaged that as Club Carib, and that's what I had experience with.
Okay.
So it's a cool thing. We're going to get Joerg set up on this soon so we can play on it too, because he's got Wi-Fi modems. He hasn't used them yet.
Yeah.
So that's what's happening in a minute. Before that happens, do we have news?
Well, yesterday we had the retro mini playing show on our Twitch channel.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. In case you missed that, we will link to the recording in the description.
You might want to miss it.
No, it's wonderful.
I love it when things. I love it when things don't work quite the way you want them to, and this was one of those examples of just everything kind of. My favorite part of it was I had to plug my phone in, and I got up, and my mic stand fell over, and it was just a constant. Oh.
On my side, however, everything worked.
Joerg was very happy with things. I was watching a slideshow and struggling to see anything in the chat. Oh, it was
Yeah, and I had a problem understanding you because the audio quality was pretty crappy.
Yeah.
Anyway, on my side, we can say that we figured out the Mega Drive limited edition from Tactile actually has RGB, it seems, despite I was told earlier that they removed it for cost reduction, because on the stream it's in color, and because it's PAL M, which is American NTSC broadcast standard with European color information, because TV was brought by America to Brazil, but Philips in the Netherlands brought color. That is why you have this bizarre PAL M, like Marta, PAL M standard that nobody else is using except Brazil. And the funny thing is, most LCDs or projectors here in Germany, they support it, but older CRT TVs don't.
Right.
And I'm using a USB grabber from TerraTech, and the support told me, yes, we support RGB. And it seems that despite I was told it's removed, it isn't. So if you want to learn about the Mega Drive Mini, also called Flashback, and the tactile release compared to an earlier retro-gen Firecore portable listened or watched that stream. There we talk all about that, and also we talk a bit about you mainly did about color palettes and emulation and stuff from a graphic guy point of view.
Well, no,
so there is some information interesting in there.
Yeah, well, no, my argument was more that one of the charming things about the 64 and about these other machines is that it has a limited palette, a limited resolution. So you turn your 64 on, and you've got a 320 by 200 screen with 16 colors. If it's multicolor, it's 160 by 200, and that's what the machine is capable of putting out. When you turn on one of these consoles, you get a splash screen, and then you get this thing where you can select the games that you want to play, and it's 24 million color 720p video, and that right there ruins it, because I see that and it's like, oh, this machine does not really have those limitations that an original NES or 64 or whatever would have, and it just kind of I can no longer suspend my disbelief into pretending that I'm actually using a C64, or that I'm using an NES or a Genesis or a Mega Drive or whatever you want to call it. It just kind of messes with my ability to believe that this is an actual piece of hardware. And suddenly I feel like I'm using an emulator, because that's essentially what it is.
I see.
So,
all right. So,
anyway, yeah.
Any news next to that?
Well, the SidFX has had a recall.
Yeah.
So there's a problem with the first edition run, I think, and part of the second with the SidFX, and I'm not really sure of what mine was. Mine is one of the ones that is affected, but for the life of me, I can't figure out. It seems to work fine to me. It works properly, so I'm sending it in anyway to get it fixed. If you go to sidfx.dk, they should have a thing there. The service is very inexpensive. It's something like $8 or something. It's not significant. And then you send yours in, and they'll fix it and send it back to you if it falls within the range. And they tell you how to find out if yours is one of the affected units. So that's cool that they are continuing to support them. And they're making more of them. You can actually buy a brand new one right now if you want to, but they're also supporting the original run that they made for us early adopters.
And also by the same crew is actually YumFM, which is actually starting a second batch, and they recently sent out emails asking certain people to do
pay for
payment in advance, to cover the necessary amount to start even production.
Yes.
And in case they fail, you would get your money returned.
But they haven't failed. I think they said that they made it, so they're doing it.
Yeah.
So sweet awesomeness.
Should we mention that you will try to put that in or not?
We can say that one of the things that we want to do moving forward with this is we would like to support a lot of different things in the magazine in Scene World, and one of those things would be supporting the YamFM from the magazine outfit. And it's not something that I know too much about doing, but it would be the sort of thing that if I'm not a great technical coder as far as cool demo effects and stuff like that, but it seems like something like this, like playing music or getting it, using a piece of hardware like that, is more up my alley. So I will see if I can put that in there. I'm not making any guarantees that I will be successful at making it work with the magazine outfit. But
little story. Why I got the idea to ask AJ about is actually because Matt Commodore released a driver for it that will automatically transform the SID sounds to the JamFM.
Yes. Yeah.
So the idea is to use that driver so we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Right, and not even have to have special music, on there for it. We can just use what we've got.
Yeah.
So it's definitely an interesting project to undertake. And when I was actively coding all the time on the 64, things like one of my specialties was interfacing with printers and making them printing from things that you weren't supposed to, or adding print functionality to things that didn't necessarily have it. So I think that working with peripherals is something that I'd be better at than again making a cool thing fly across the screen or something. Don't ask me to do a sprite sinus, but I can.
Okay.
I can.
But here's something. Here's something I've noticed in changing in the C64 scene. I mean, the only software I remember that ever had drivers, as we know it nowadays from the Mac or PC or Linux or whatever, was GeOS. It came with printer drivers, or VisaWrite, which was a writing program that had drivers. And nowadays, a lot of devices that you actually get for the C64 new drives and so on, they actually have drivers. So this concept of drivers, device drivers, is actually coming over to the C64.
Well, I think I think a lot of stuff had drivers. It was just not. It wasn't called a driver. We had most word processing software had printer drivers because they would use the built-in. A lot of printers would emulate the basic Commodore printers. If they didn't, you could generally do like a generic Epson, but other ones had specialty things like the Okamate. It was a color printer, so you needed special stuff for it. And there's a lot of software that you select your printer before you print and stuff like that. There's other things that require software to use it. They require a driver, but I don't know that it was ever like the 1750 RAM expansion. You plug that into the back of your 64, and nothing. The 64 has no idea it's there. The software that you use has no idea it's there unless they're programmed for it. They have the driver to use it built into the software. So I
think there was always drivers, but
yeah,
there
were drivers for using this stuff. It just wasn't. They didn't call it a driver. It was just RAM expansion enabled or something. It had the code to take advantage of it, but it wasn't necessarily called a driver for it because that's driver. It feels modular, kind of like you would have in Geos or something like that. But a lot of this stuff was just it's either you have it or you don't.
That is my hope, that you say, will you take the driver from Met Commodore and just insert it into Scene World, and then it will magically work. That's the idea,
it very well
right?
could. It very well could. There would be parts of it that would be detect whether the thing's plugged in. If it's plugged in, execute this code or shunt the code to this location. And if it's not, then your regular SID code. So that would be it should be fairly easy to implement. It's just a matter of I haven't looked at the code for the magazine outfit in a long time, and it was pretty rough the last time I did. Implementing it in a brand new outfit, Oliver, would be far easier probably than putting it into what we've got, because there's been the code we're using now has been around for what, like 20 years?
18 years.
Yeah, 18 years, and it is not anywhere near what it originally was. There's been so many different hands in it, so many different people tweaking it to make it work better. It's kind of a mishmash of, this tiny section here is what, Robin wrote 18 years ago. And, here's a bit that Andrew added, 10 years later. And here's a bit that someone else added. And here's something that someone originally wrote, and then somebody tweaked to do this and the other side. And so it's an undertaking.
Right.
Other news. Go to that website. We'll link down there, and you can. I'm pointing like someone can see me.
GemFM?
This was like Zentax.com.
Yeah,
something.
exactly. Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah. We're coming up on our... people may notice this is podcast number 49.
Yeah.
And that means that we're coming up on number 50 real soon.
Right.
Which means we're done. We can go home. It's over. Thank you. Good night.
No, it means we actually are now allowed to have our own section at the web archive.
Oh, yes.
Archive.org.
That too.
I am in touch with them in the last 4 years, and they always told me, once you reached 50 of something, let us know, and we will create a special section for Scene World.
Don't we have 50 blog posts on there, though? Because every podcast is a blog post, and every video is a blog post.
Yeah, we have over 50 videos, but podcast is more likely that people will go there and listen to it.
Okay.
So I will email them back and say, hey, we reached our 50 podcasts now. Please make out the section. If you wanna learn more about the history of Archive and how archive.org was the first YouTube, you can actually watch the interview I did with Stuart Chaffee, because he is one of the guys that was an early supporter of the web archive, which is also known as Wayback Machine.
Yes.
Where you can visit old websites that are not around anymore. Yes, so that means next step in our Scene World history.
Yeah.
I'm very proud we did this. And for you people to know, is actually the concept for the podcast originally was different. You know, AJ had the idea of making just the two of us talking. And I was the one saying, no, I want to have a special guest every time on it. So, right.
Well, my concept is really just, hey, I got this cool microphone at a thrift store. Let's do something with it.
Yeah. Right. So looking back to the podcast, we had a pretty good run early on. I mean, considering at the beginning we didn't have much listeners. I mean, our second one was already Return of Cinemaware.
It's all been downhill since our first 6.
No, not really. I mean, just recently we had big names like Rob Hubbard, Chester Colson, Robert Bernardo, which is a very known U.S. American guy. Or David Fox, who doesn't know David Fox?
We should really be talking about this in number 50, not number 49, because this is not the 50th anniversary yet, or the 50th episode.
Too bad.
But, yeah, so...
Who cares?
So, 50's coming up. Have some cool stuff in plan for that.
This is really crazy, because the news are mainly about Scene World this time.
Yeah.
We are just talking about us. Oh yes. Well, there is a new Mega Drive. There is a new NES Mini being released with anime games by Nintendo. So
okay.
And especially Senat Palic was totally jazzed about it. Like, well, I don't know in Japan, but I want this. So let me have a look at Amazon Japan, what's actually called, because Amazon Japan is nice enough to have a fully translated English interface. Okay, what I've got. Yep. It's called Nintendo Kuriskumi Famicom Weekly Boy Jumping in 15th Anniversary Edition and Ultimate Muscle Fist Dragon Ball.
Okay then.
Wonderful. And this is, well, the one that has all the enemies.
Right.
Gosh. That's the one that has all the anime stuff in it.
Okay.
Yep.
I got one actually that just popped up on my thing.
Okay, sure. Tell me.
Yeah. So this is actually pretty interesting. So the Intellivision is being rebooted. And it's not what you would expect. Normally, if someone were to tell me that, oh, hey, they're going to reboot the Intellivision, my first thought would be, oh, it's going to be another mini. Another, flashback kind of console where it looks kind of like it and you turn it on and it shows you all these old games that you can play and that's it. That's not what they're doing. So Intellivision is making a new console. They're making new games. They're focusing a lot on the controller. The original Intellivision controller was this thing with like a keypad up top and a disc on the bottom that was sort of a D-pad.
I know, yeah.
And they're going to make the same controller, same sort of thing, except that instead of the buttons and the overlays, it's going to be a touch screen. And the disc is still going to be there instead of the D-pad. And it said games that you will not see on it are nothing is violent, no violent games, nothing complicated. If you can't explain the game in 10 seconds, or if it needs a manual, it's not going to be on the system. And they're not going to be doing any 3D.
Okay.
So that's kind of interesting to see how that'll do, because that does not sound like... It's not going to be like a super advanced system. It's not going to be a PS4 or an Xbox or anything like that. It's going to be something different and simpler.
Ooh.
They cite the Wii, and saying that they kind of Nintendo sort of dropped the ball with the Wii because initially the Wii came out and they targeted everybody and it did really well. But then after a little bit of time, Nintendo sort of stopped targeting everybody and went back to doing Nintendo things. Like here's more Mario Kart, here's another of these games, here's another of that games. But they stopped marketing to your mom, essentially. And so Intellivision wants to focus on everybody.
Well, that's actually good. It's actually good.
That could be interesting. So far, there's no specs for the thing out, so we don't know what it's running. I don't know if it's an x86 platform like the what's the other thing that was the new Atari, the VCS. I don't know if it's going to be, if it's going to be custom designed FPGA or what it's going to be doing. It's supposed to be revealed October 1st, 2018 is when the big reveal happens. They're planning to have at least 10 launch games.
Wow.
They're not asking for any crowdfunding or pre-orders. So that's
cool.
That is interesting. It's I don't know what to think of it because the Intellivision was terrible.
I know.
Let's not mince words here. It was not the best game console. I mean, for the time, I guess 1979, it was pretty interesting at the time, and they sold it until 1990, which is way later than I thought.
Wow.
But very simple games and nothing blocky pixel graphics and well outclassed, despite the fact that it was 16-bit. It was far outclassed by stuff like the 64.
Of course.
So so we'll see how that does. We'll keep our eyes on that, and then do you have any more news?
For me, not right now. No.
Okay, well then we've got Steve Salevan is over there hanging out in Habitat in World. No, he's not in World.
In World.
In World, yeah. That's the industry term for on the game. So we should pop over there and talk about Habitat and all the fun, cool stuff that happens there. So we're talking today with Steve Salevan. He is one of the main developers behind Neohabitat, bringing back the original 64 online community that happened back in the 80s. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, now, I had very limited interaction with Habitat in my youth. I was always fascinated because I had actually this thing, the buyer's guide for the 64 that came with my machine, which had Habitat on the cover. But it doesn't say anything in there about what it is or anything. So I always just would see this and be like, that looks really cool, but I have no idea what it is. And then
that was a very common thing with Habitat. I think it was far more popular in legend than it really ever became amongst people who ever got a chance to play it.
Right. And when I actually got onto Q-Link much later, which was probably, I want to say 91 or 92, it had been converted into Club Carib, which was not.
Oh yeah.
Which was like a neutered version of Habitat, from what I gather.
Indeed, it was. What was interesting was that I'm pretty sure the Quantum company eventually became America Online. They just didn't really quite grasp what they were trying to do with Habitat, and Club Carib in most cases was an attempt to kind of focus on the more tropical aspects. There's a particularly popular section of the world called the beach section, and so they were like, well, let's just kind of lean into that, and it was cool, but the original Habitat was just so much more full-featured, had so many more cool things you could do in world.
Yeah, there's it's immersive and kind of enormous in scale from what you can do, and it was one of those things where I had, played Club Carib when I was actually on the thing, which didn't last very long because I was a kid and I was running up huge 8 cents per minute bills.
Oh, yeah.
So it wasn't very long before the plug got pulled on that. But seeing it come back is one of those things that it's just real cool to see. And now, unlike Q-Link Reloaded, because they've also relaunched Quantumlink, but they had to figure out, this is how this works, and this is what they had to look at it from the client disks and try to figure out what's it asking for from the server and how is this supposed to function. This was different to do on Neohabitat because the documentation for it kind of existed, correct?
Yeah, so we not only had documentation, but we had the full original source, a database dump from the 1980s, and most crucially, we had the active participation of the two original creators, Chip Morningstar and Randy Farmer. Randy Farmer in particular was the leader of the project, and so he really helped to give us a major head start by creating not only something that could speak the Habitat protocol, but also the beginnings of the game server built on technology they developed post-Habitat called Elko that has been used to power some startups, and Habitat was kind of meant to be a little bit of a marquee application for such things.
And I wonder, was there no problem with copyright or trademark or something?
So it's funny you mentioned that because the way this all started was that Alex Handy of the Museum of Art and Digital Entertainment, I also do a podcast with him called 5 Nines of Downtime, just a really interesting person. He reached out to Fujitsu using some of the legal staff from the museum he ran, and Fujitsu agreed to allow us to, without restriction, to redevelop the entire Habitat project. And what's particularly interesting is that Habitat's now being used as a project to help justify, a DMCA exemption for other MMOs like Habitat, where the client software exists, but where the servers have been turned down. There have been some interest in redeveloping things like Neverwinter Nights, if you recall that from the early days of America Online. And the way it's looking, I really don't know too much about the trial, but it seems that Habitat has provided some very substantive evidence as to what can happen when the legal precedent is there and when the ambition and the talent is there as well.
I also wonder, were other people from the adventures involved, like David Fox and Ron Gilbert? Because it has pretty much the style of Maniac Mansion and Zack McCracken adventures.
Yes, and what's interesting was that there's actually a little bit of Maniac Mansion art in Habitat. You can become an avatar that is a tentacle, which is pretty wild. There's also a chainsaw that doesn't work, which is one of my personal favorites. Ron Gilbert actually wrote some of the disk loader, like Lucasfilm disk loader and bootloader routines, were written by him. David Fox was definitely around development. I think I've even seen him in World once or twice since that. And another thing that's cool is that the rendering engine from Habitat was very unique and kind of was the precedent for a lot of things, particularly things like Scum. So Chip Morningstar was the co-creator of Scum with Ron Gilbert. And the way that things were rendered on the screen through Habitat was done not through sprites, but through direct, to bitmap buffer rendering, which was extremely advanced for the time and allowed for the creation of things like Scum, because you no longer had to do sprite programming. You instead could be a little bit more expressive in how you specified game dynamics and stuff like that.
Yeah, I remember being as a coder looking at it and trying to figure out, how is this done? And you think to yourself, a head is probably a sprite, but then you look at it and it's like there's too many things on here than sprites could account for, especially with the technology of the time. The way that how advanced coding was back then. We didn't really know too much about it. It's not doing raster interrupts and sprite multiplexing at the time. So,
Indeed.
it's cool to try to look at it and figure out how it's done, and that's real cool that it would do that. Now, does this predate the Scum engine?
It predates the Scum engine by about a year or two, yeah. Okay. It actually, it was a contemporary with Labyrinth, if you remember that. And, I think what's really interesting is that so we have the original 6502 source. It was actually written in a language that Chip developed called Macross, which aimed to combine, the dynamics of a 6502 assembler with the macro capacity of, say, like a C, a C kind of, macro language. And so this allowed for, again, a very kind of expressive form of 6502 assembly, and even for those who understand object-oriented programming, it's perhaps the very first documented example that I know of object-oriented 6502. It is just some really wild code. I strongly recommend reading through it because it's pretty much the most readable 6502 I've ever seen in my life. And I mean, I'm mostly I'm a Golang Java guy, so looking back on 6502 assembly that I can read, it just was revelatory.
But as I said, AJ, there was no sprite multiplexing, but I think there was, because 85, the NES, Nintendo World Cup used it pretty badly. But
but as far as the state of coding on the 64 was in 86 or 85 when it was being developed or so, maybe some demos may have made use of some of that, but commercial games, it was pretty rare.
Absolutely.
On the 64 anyway.
Especially in that time. And, really, I think one of the fundamental things to kind of note is that, Lucasfilm was really a pioneer of some rather unorthodox microcomputer development techniques. In those days, they did all of their development on Unix, typically on Sun workstations. And then what they do to actually develop it on the 64 is that they had this device that would just plug into the cartridge port. And since you got the full bus, of the 64 on that thing, it would just basically shove all the bits in the memory just like that. And so, you could do all your development in what we consider to be a much more modern environment, but be able to instantaneously test your code on a 64 from there.
So what was let's go into your history here. How did you get started with this? Because you don't seem that old to have been, working on this when it came out. And you said earlier that you didn't get to experience this when it was actually happening. So
that's great.
Too young for a retro.
Yeah, so actually, so my dad had a Commodore 64 and was a user of Quantumlink, and I remember, reading in some of the magazines about this thing called Club Carib, and that always stuck in the back of my mind because it looked just so incredibly ahead of its time, for the 1980s. And so, I did some Googling. This must have been back in the early 2000s, and discovered something called Worlds Away and V-Zones. And I ultimately joined those communities, made some really good friends there. And, more or less, I'd always kind of had this fantasy in the back of my mind of, being able to check out Habitat once again. It just seemed like it was lost to the winds. And so, for me, I worked in technology for over 10 years, worked for companies like Twitter and Tumblr, Google and Red Hat. And, I've been doing a lot of development in a lot of different ways. And, I was just sitting in my apartment out here in New York, a couple years back. This must have been back in 2014. I was browsing through the Reddit forums, Reddit/r/C64 as one does on a Sunday afternoon.
Yes.
And they were like, we're trying to recreate Habitat. And I was like, oh my God, I need to get in this like post haste. So I hopped in their IRC room. Within the space of like 3 or 4 minutes, I was talking to Randy Farmer, like one of my childhood heroes, and he, we were talking the same language, and it was like, this is magical. Like, I never really get, you always get a chance to like read about legends, but it's always been kind of like a fantasy of mine to have an opportunity to like, to work with one. And what was cool is that during that hackathon, what we worked on was to basically take the source code of Qlink Reloaded and then modify it in such a way that we could make it an intelligent proxy between the Qlink protocol and the Habitat server, because we needed another server, which Randy ultimately developed, to go and translate what was coming out of Qlink to something that the Elko server, which spoke entirely in JSON-based RPCs, could understand. And so we were able to work on that part. We got it together, and by the end of that hackathon, we got the first screen of Habitat to load. It was an avatar with no head standing in a room with a sign, and it was magical. We were like, wow, this is a crazy experience for a full day. The trouble was, at the end of that day, we had the source code for a Stratus, and through the unbelievably awesome efforts of Alex Handy, they were able to go and acquire one of these, and it was working, and they even got it running, and they got the code loaded onto it, and they discovered that because this code was developed very much in tandem with the original Quantumlink source from America Online, there were several headers and libraries that were missing. And so at the end of the day, we came within spitting distance of having the whole situation working, but we would need code from America Online to complete that experience. And so that ended up taking quite a bit of time. We reached out to America Online, and they said they'd be interested in working with us, but they dragged their feet quite a bit. And I suppose like they had bigger things to worry about, being sold to Oath and what have you. Speaking as a former 2-week Yahoo employee.
Yeah.
In any case, like what happened was that back in 2016 or whereabouts, Randy said that he was just going to rewrite the server from scratch and was looking for some folks to join in the project. And I just quit my job at Twitter at that time to start my own company, and I had about a month of gap time. And I was like, man, I need to get into something that's just like a purely fun hack. And oh my God, this ever proved to be that. It was hands down one of the most enjoyable like development projects I have ever been involved in my life. Just an absolute joy to hack on. Nothing quite like debugging with a Commodore 64. I tell you what, that's just so much fun.
That's really interesting how you mentioned that AOL was actually willing to help out, though they were a little preoccupied with stuff, because I was always under the impression, at least when it came to the AOL stuff, or the Qlink stuff, that when they had gotten rid of that and transitioned over, they just sort of tossed that out, and they wouldn't have even had anything left over from it.
So what was interesting was that a lot of the protocol, like particularly the Qlink protocol and the servers that they ran, ultimately became the backbone of America Online 1.0, and that was one of the major reasons they had to shut down Quantumlink, because they just didn't have enough computers to keep the thing running. And so, it seemed to me, and don't quote me on this. I mean, we're on a podcast, so I suppose that's just kind of inherent. But one way or another, like I think some of that might have even been ticking in their infrastructure well into the 90s and the 2000s. And so it was kind of fascinating. Like all the folks at America Online seemed very interested in the project, but I think that they were just a little bit too busy to really become actively involved.
And as a result of the fact that you guys have the documentation and you've been able to kind of even put more time into it, Qlink Reloaded or Rebooted or whatever it's called now is sort of it's kind of a snapshot of what it looked like, but half of it doesn't really work. I don't know if you've been on it at all.
Oh yeah, well we actually run a QLR server in front of Habitat.
Oh, okay.
What's interesting about QLR is that there's a whole lot of so the most important thing to really take care of when you're working with Quantumlink is that really unique kind of over-the-wire protocol that they developed. Because more or less back in the 80s, they used what were called time-sharing networks or packet-sharing networks, which were effectively like really, really, really long serial cables to a mainframe. And so, the Quantumlink protocol was designed to kind of encapsulate chunks of communication between a Commodore and their Stratus mainframes into a text-based protocol that could go over these like serial lines, and the Habitat protocol was encapsulated within that as well. And so the fundamental issue that we ran into was that we needed to figure out a way to get a Commodore to get all the way out to our services so we could start to iteratively develop in that way. And so that was really the first major challenge. And I think QLR, is just it's a pretty amazing code base from 2004. Like, it's very Java 1.4, but at the same time, like the amounts of detail and the amount of research that went into it, and just kind of like the quality of the code by 2004 standards is astounding. Jim Brain is hands down like an absolute mad genius. That guy was the main person behind the project initially, and he just like through sheer force of will was able to figure all of this stuff out from documentation and hacking around on this client disks. It is astounding what they accomplished there.
Right. But still, a lot
Jim
of it
Brain
is,
has a name.
Still a lot of it is sort of placeholder. This is not available at this point. Whereas you guys, Neohabitat, from what I've been able to see, is almost complete in how it's been rebuilt. Like everything is there.
Yes, indeed. So that was one of our project goals, to basically go and present the kind of experience, if not even a better experience than someone would have had in '87. And the benefit of building it on modern technology is the fact that we can support far more folks in world. And I remember like on our inaugural day, we had 150 people simultaneously on, which I think rivaled any experience anybody would have had back in the '80s. And realistically, like, we've been able to do some really cool things. Like in particular, Stu, who will hopefully be coming in World sometime soon, was able to, working with another person named Nate, to recover an original 1987 database dump of the entire Habitat world and restore everything to its original state. So there are like over 3,000 regions that you can go and explore. It's really easy to get lost in there.
Yeah.
As I said, the experience is nowadays better than what you had back then in the 80s. How much users could you have simultaneously, maximum?
So that was actually one of the biggest technical hurdles they ran into in the 80s. I think it was very difficult to have more than about 300 before like all of the Q-Link computing capacity generally got eaten up. Habitat was a lot more resource intensive just by nature of the way that the game worked than Q-Link itself, which was, really, when it all came down to it, kind of like a really spicy terminal and bulletin board that had like some, some cool things. Like I really recommend checking out the Q-Link protocol because it'll remind you a little bit of something like JavaScript. It's designed to kind of, send client commands to the Commodore to do things on your screen, and then the Commodore is kind of like sending RPCs back to the server to tell it, responses or to initiate other sorts of things. And so that was a lot simpler than Habitat. Habitat was just like always talking back and forth, all sorts of bits of information and lots of processing. And those were all like 68,000 based machines, these Stratus VOS servers. And so those hamsters were going nuts out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Now going into the future with this, there are some parts in it where you see, it's an empty building and it's not quite back to where it was, and there's usually a message there saying, if we're trying to rebuild this all. If you can help, then by all means. But what's the plan to really kind of get everything? Like what are those areas and what are they missing, and what needs to be done to really pull it back into what it was?
Well, I would say so. Out of what remains to be done, and things have changed pretty dramatically over the past like 6 or 7 months, especially with the work that Stu and Nate have been doing. Mm-hmm. So initially, like we had under construction zones because we hadn't finished the conversion of those parts of the world. But I think almost the entirety, I'd say pretty much 99% of the original 87 launch world is intact and in the shape that it was originally. Another thing that's notable is that there are over 100 different object classes that are in world, and all of those are fully implemented, line for line from the original PL1 source. Honestly, I think like the biggest challenge that we're facing with Habitat right now is in attracting people to come check it out, because in particular, like, compared to other sorts of, online MMOs, this one requires, to some degree, a little bit more, a little bit more, fiddle.
Right.
You need to load up like an emulator, and we have packages for that, but it's a little bit more involved than going to a web page, and I think that results in a lot of people kind of coming in sort of a diffuse way. And when people actually meet each other in world, it's magical. People are like, whoa, this is working on a Commodore? This is crazy. And, we even have like some folks like a fellow named Flexman who has a Commodore 128 that he uses to log in pretty much every day. And, it's mostly just kind of I think a community and publicity building thing right now, because, the world is there. It's just kind of a matter of getting people in it and showing them like what they can do. We have all sorts of different ways avatars can interact. Particularly, we have like like weapons in the game. We have a full like economy-based system. Ways to customize your avatar. Everybody has their own personal turf. It's just like, I personally have met like a lot of really interesting people through Habitat who just kind of show up. And one of the things we tried to do to kind of stave off the kind of walking through like a dead mall kind of environment is to implement some not only like a bot framework, but also some bots who kind of help it to feel a little bit less barren. And whenever anybody logs in, it'll also drop a message into our Slack to let people know, hey, people are in the world, you should come check us out. Come say hello.
Okay, now there are, aside from using it on an actual 64, there are downloads, which is, from what I can gather, it's the software bundled with a version of Vice?
That's correct. So it's bundled with a version of Vice, and it also, that version of Vice is configured to speak to the servers that we maintain for Neohabitat. So, particularly, I developed the one for Mac OS, and it's just as simple as dragging it to applications and double-clicking, and you're pretty much in world at that point.
Okay, yeah, because I tried that out. Mine, it doesn't work on mine because I have Vice on mine already, and I think that my version of Vice tries to take over the settings of that one.
Yeah, they all get stored in roughly the same place, especially on a Mac. And the challenge is, like, at least on Mac, some of the newer versions of Vice don't work as well as older versions because of the way that the serial protocol kind of works.
Right.
Altogether, though, we're all very very impressed at just how successful Vice has been at simulating the Commodore 64 quirks and features in a way that would allow Habitat to work at all.
Well, I guess by now Vice is pretty much accurate.
Oh yeah.
I remember like 12 years ago, it was still a bit sloppy on the NTSC emulation side, and people were saying like, Vice is great, but only use it for PAL, never for NTSC.
Yeah. Actually, what's interesting is that Habitat pretty much needs to work in NTSC. I mean, it works fine in PAL, but it's a little bit slower because of the 50 versus 60 hertz, conversion. And so if you end up switching your device into NTSC mode, using Habitat, you'll get pretty much like if you've ever seen any of the videos on YouTube, you'll get like a point for point kind of recreation of something like that.
Right.
If I use it on my VZ64, I will make sure to use my NTSC one.
Nice, yeah. Definitely like NTSC for sure if you want to get that experience. But PAL definitely should work fine too.
Yeah.
I wonder. So you said it's a bit more difficult for new users to get into it. So what kind of promotions are you doing next to talking on podcasts? Are you having plans to get this out of the world in a way?
I don't know.
I wonder.
No one really listens to us, so I don't know how much help we're going to be.
That's not what I mean. I just mean it sounded like you were planning on a promotion tour or something. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Just wonder.
Well, that's certainly something that is still kind of very much up in the air. We have gotten some press. Wired did a write-up on us. Vice Motherboard did a write-up on us. But that was sort of back in the days of development. And when we released on our beta release back in June, we ended up reaching out to Hacker News. We put something up on Hacker News, and that ended up getting us some folks. But I think the challenge right now is kind of finding the right publicity and getting the word out to people who might be interested in playing this, because those people kind of trickle in through some of the disparate press that Habitat has received. But it'd be really cool to kind of get some sort of convocation. I like to call it the happening. We want to have a happening inside Habitat, and see if we can't attract some people who really enjoy retro computing and want to kind of see sort of the progenitor of all modern graphical MMOs. So if y'all have any ideas, feel free to give me a ring. Just hop on the Neohabs Slack, and we'd love to talk with anybody who might be interested in helping us with that.
I think now talking to you, we definitely should get Randy Farmer also on it when he's not sick anymore.
Absolutely, Randy is one of the best podcasters that I know. That fella has such a great radio voice. I tell you what.
I thought you are the guy with the radio voice, aren't you?
Oh, yeah, I used to host a show back on a station called WKNC. I was the local music director, helped to bring some bands like Future Islands and Bon Iver, helped to kind of, Bon Iver was very much their own thing, but I helped to kind of promote them in their early stages of their careers.
So, do you think at some point you will be 100% complete? As you said, you aren't finished yet, and you're still working on getting the final quirks to run, the rooms that are not finished yet, and so on.
Well, the way we see it, we're pretty much we are at what you might call general availability.
Okay.
Right now, I think we're comfortable at calling it just about 100%. There might be some work on the periphery, but I would say that in general, like anyone joining Habitat right now will be getting an extremely accurate representation of what the experience was like.
And it's really up to the users, to create their content. It's sort of, you've given this empty slate, this is the world, now do your thing. Sort of like how Second Life tried to do it with, have your in-game currency and economy, and it's up to the users to create and have something. I've explained, I've described it to Joerg as kind of like, it's Second Life but faster. But
and without Linden dollars.
Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah.
But it's really up to the users to come in and start doing stuff and populating these areas. And that's one of the things that I've seen a lot, is that a couple of times I've seen somebody in world with me. Usually from the times that I've been on, I'm generally alone, but you can always tell that someone's been there because things have been moved around. Or doors that I opened and forgot about have been closed again. So someone's been through there fixing things that I've moved.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the real appeal of Habitat. Like, when it starts to get a real, lived-in feel, particularly, back in the 80s, people would just drop pieces of paper around everywhere. Mm-hmm. I know, with my personal Phil Collins affliction, I did that, all over. And there was this one memorable moment when a screencaster was coming through, and he's like, I don't get the whole Phil Collins thing. And I was like, yes. But yeah, I mean, you're so right. Second Life really wouldn't have become a thing if it wasn't for the vast influx of people who joined and added interesting content and built things that were worthwhile. And realistically, an MMO, and this was something that Chip and Randy and the team at Lucasfilm discovered even back in the 80s. And you'll read about it in the white paper that they wrote about the experience. An MMO is, really just kind of like a really elaborate container for people to kind of make what they will out of it. And I think that's the real potential of something like this, particularly for people to come and, discover other interesting, like-minded people. I mean, that was certainly the major reason why I started the project, period, because I don't know, I've been working in social media for a while, and I kind of wanted to see if we couldn't build a place that, kind of enabled, people to talk to one another in a chill fashion, a way that would be conducive towards making friendships, as opposed to kind of, going for the jugular like you might find on something like Facebook. And, much to my own delight, I very much found that to be the case. All the people I've met through Habitat have not only like really enjoyed the experience, but on top of that, a lot of them, even when we have differing opinions, there's just kind of something about the awkwardness of that Commodore 64 user interface that just really, it's really hard to troll. I mean, you got to be a real dedicated troll to troll in Habitat.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the experience a couple of times, and the thing is, knowledge, as I figure out, each year I'm getting older and into this retro hobby, knowledge is getting lost because the young generation didn't experience it before, haven't heard of it before, and all the info source you have is Google and Wikipedia. How accurate can that be, And I think it's important to make sure that things are preserved. And I don't know how much you know about the situation here in Europe, but since 2015, video games are seen as a part of preservable culture, just like movies.
Uh-huh.
So actually, the European Union is putting money into preserving video games as a form of art and stuff. Yeah, since 3 years. Yeah. So I don't know, but I think in the US, it's not like the government is involved.
Yeah, I really wish that there were like more folks out there, given like the same level of support that we have to restore games like this, because realistically, the Commodore is such an interesting example, in as much as there will always be a substantial community around the 64 because of how fun it is to program, and just all the cool things you can kind of get that thing to do. And realistically, I don't think the Commodore 64 is ever going to die. Like when the Starship Enterprise comes out and Captain Picard gets into a battle with the Borg, like there's going to be at least 1 or 2 Commodore 64s like on the holodeck or something that's going to be playing. I don't know, like okay. And so I think what's been interesting to me is just discovering how many people my age are still very much into retro computing, and who just kind of acquired a taste for it while young, and have been spreading the love of it around to other folks. In particular, at the VCF this year, there was a really awesome kid who came up and was like, he came up to the Commodore and was like, "Is that a user port modem?" And I was like, "Oh my goodness!" I was getting flashbacks to my own misspent youth. It was just a thing to behold. But particularly things like YouTube and the 8-bit guy, which we were recently featured on actually, are helping to bring a lot of younger kids into the fray, because realistically, like, computing these days is just so advanced that to the beginner it's still like can seem somewhat insurmountable. And Commodore, you just have to switch that thing on and you're programming.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
that was hugely inspirational to me. I don't think I would have ever gotten into a career in technology if it wasn't for just how low that barrier of entry is. And so my hope is retro computing for younger generations can provide that same kind of context, and through emulation and through things like the Ultimate 64 project and everything, we can help to bring that technology to people who can use it to develop a genuine love for building cool things.
Right.
From
the 64,
Gideon Schweizer, yeah.
The 64 has a certain. I'm not sure who said it. It's a statement. I think it was one of our guests maybe, but retro computer or not just retro computer, but computing used to be that was your hobby or your interest was computers. And nowadays computers are really just, they're appliances. You don't think about what's happening to it, right? You open up your laptop, you go on YouTube and watch some videos or something, but the computer as a hobby doesn't exist like it used to. And that's really a barrier for a lot of people, because on the 64, if you wanted to do something, you had to figure out how to do it yourself. If there was a piece of software that came out with a bug, you weren't going to be getting a live update. You had to fix it yourself if you wanted to fix it. And that's something that doesn't happen anymore, because there's this layer, like I don't know what any of the chips in my laptop are. I couldn't tell you what that processor is or what this thing over here with the graphics does. I have no idea. Where I can list off every single chip in that 64 and what they do and how they do it.
And I remember who that was. It was Lobsang Alvitus.
Okay, there you go.
That mentioned it, and it was in our third podcast, the Peruvian scene, where we talked about how the Peruvian C64 programmers, sceners that only got the C64 in the black market, had to reverse engineer how modems work to make BBSs work. Yeah.
I mean, I do think that we have lost something from those days. I mean, computing is so much more widespread, but at the same time, I think people are much more willing to kind of cede things to computers. Particularly like their information, and in a lot of ways, I remember like Ted Nelson in Computers Live back in the 70s. He used to write that, computers were tools to oppress people. And I always thought that was just like some serious like 1960s kind of granola talk. But the more that I've certainly have come to understand like large scale distributed systems, the more I kind of realize that there are huge ways that those can change and otherwise, in a negative or even a malicious sense, can create situations between human beings that otherwise wouldn't have existed without them. And so I think now more than ever, it's really important to promote not only computer literacy but also just sort of like a love for doing things that aren't like actively trying to harm mankind. I mean, I'm not including Twitter in this because Twitter is I think an extremely ethical company with a lot of extremely ethical people working for them, and Jack as well is a very ethical person. But there just are a lot of folks out there who are using this differential between people who don't know anything about computers and people who know a lot to exploit those who don't, and that's such a bummer.
Right, yeah.
But there are also people in their 20s that are getting backwards interested into things that were happening before they were even born. I mean, I know somebody who was 20 and he is a self-proclaimed CRT repairing expert.
That's fantastic.
So,
I mean, there really is an appeal in that, retro computing provides, an opportunity to really get your hands on the metal in a way that a modern computer wouldn't. And, I know like there's a group out here in New York called NYC Resistor, who are just a lot of, young, technologically oriented people who just love doing all sorts of crazy stuff, like recovering stuff off of like deck tapes and, recovering punched, punched rolls of tape and stuff. Just really a lot of fascinating people who understand the potential in preserving our technological history.
Tape.
Yeah. We don't have to preserve that.
Was that a cassette tape?
It's a cleaning tape. It's useful.
It's fantastic.
Preserve everything else. The tapes can go away.
No, that's bullshit. I like tapes. I mean, of course, I would still prefer a diskette version, but I mean, some have great loaders, music, little games playing in between while you're waiting for the game to load. It's just because you didn't experience in America doesn't mean it's awful.
Oh, I know. I experienced it. It was an experience that I had, and it's an experience that you can keep.
Well, luckily you are. Well, not everybody's thinking like that.
And my experience would have been faster being NTSC. So.
Yeah, good.
No,
that's good.
10 hertz. Yeah. That 10 hertz matters.
Yeah, exactly. But now you said that there's you're running Q-Link Reloaded in front of that. Is that something that you can log into with the Q-Link disk, or is that just something that's there to bolster the habitat?
Absolutely. In fact, if you're on an original 64 or 128, that's actually the only way that you... Well, actually, I take that back. That's one of the ways that you can get in. We also established a special habitat-only protocol that can also be accessed via a physical machine. a fella who is a VP now at Warner Brothers came in and gave us a hand on developing a specific client and fast loader that makes it really easy for people to get into the world very quickly. And they were able to adapt that to work with like the Y modem and some of the other modem peripherals that are available for the 64.
And I think that's what I'm using, because it boots directly into Habitat, and then you have to go to the terminal and connect to the server, and then go into Habitat from there. What's the server for the Q-Link Reloaded thing? Because I haven't seen that anywhere.
So it's the exact same server, app.neohabitat.org. It just runs on port 5190, which is the traditional America Online Q-Link port.
Okay.
And yeah, like more or less, I know things like the Y modem have specific settings for that. And if you can find like a standard Q-Link disk, there's still a couple around the internet. I think we even have one of our own in one of our repos. It's pretty trivial to get online.
I've got 75 of them over there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Nick Vivid, one of our editors and NTSC supporters, actually is doing one of the strike term modem, right?
Yeah, the strike modem, yeah.
Yeah. Strike term is the software, and strike modem is the modem.
No, I'm sorry. Strike Link is the modem. Strike Link.
Strike Link is the modem. Strike term is the software.
Yes.
Okay.
Although in my experience, I didn't try it with that. I'm using the Australian one to log into.
Oh, the Melbourne.
Yeah.
Yeah. That definitely works with Neohab.
Yeah, and the Strike Link should work with it, because it's basically, they're all essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
But I haven't.
I mean, the challenge is just with certain kinds of modems, like there's something that Q-Link does that's special. I kind of forget what it is, but things like the strike modem and the Melbourne and the Y modem all have special settings that are designed to work with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've gotten all three of them to work with Q-Link Reloaded, the server run by Jazzmaz. But I've only tried the one on Habitat, because I keep the Melbourne one set to 1200 baud by default, and I just use that for Q-Link, and whatever else needs 1200. Then the other ones are like set to 96, so that I can actually do something on the boards with them.
It's kind of funny. I think more or less Habitat really works best at 1200 baud, which that's something you don't hear too often in the year 2018.
Right. Yeah. And it's amazing how fast it does work. It's when I say it's like Second Life but faster, it really is faster. It's you walk from one side of the screen to the next, and the next room pops up, and the screen blacks. There's a little bit of music for a second or two, and then the next thing is up. You're not waiting for loading resources. You're not, there's all this stuff that's just almost instantaneous. It feels, versus a lot of other online or MMOs where you go into something and you're waiting for scenery to load or something.
I mean, it really is astounding, just like how much of an achievement that client was. There's some features in there that really were super forward thinking. In particular, there's a garbage collector. It's a stop the world garbage collector, but that's built right in, and I think it might be one of the very first things on the C64 that ever really had something like that built in. And additionally, if you have assets cached, so on the assets disk, there are a bunch of assets all drawn by the great Gary Winnick of Maniac Mansion and other Lucasfilm fame, and more or less those will get loaded into memory, which will be happening during the region transition phase. But if those are in memory already, you walk into a region that has a lot of those already in memory, it's really a very rapid procedure. It doesn't take more than about 5 or 10 seconds. Particularly if you're walking through the woods or something, it's super rapid out there, which is helpful because it helps you play hide and seek and do some sniping.
Right, and there's also teleporters in game, so you can quickly move from place to place if you can figure out where that is you're going.
Yes, indeed.
So now this is also in cooperation with the Maid Museum. So what is
That's correct.
What is their impact or their
influence?
Yes, I suppose that's a word that I could use.
Or a participation?
Yeah. How do they participate in this?
So without the Meta, this project would have never gotten started. This all kind of started as one of the ideas that Alex Handy, who runs the Meta, had. He's like, man, it'd be really cool if we could bring back Habitat. And he's been doing reporting in enterprise computing and video games for quite a few years now, and reached out to Randy and Chip, and reached out to them, and Chip was like, hey, like, I've got a copy of the source code. that just like kicked things really into high gear. And on top of that, they also got us the legal precedent. They also got us a lot of our early press. They have been extremely supportive. They hosted they've hosted like our chat services, and they have an exhibit inside the museum now that runs Habitat. In fact, it features something we call our second screen experience, which more or less allows you to open up a tab in your web browser that'll follow your avatar around and give you some interesting help text and other bits of useful information as you're walking through.
Yeah, I actually wanted to mention that because that is one of the really cool things, because it's real easy to get lost in Habitat.
Oh, yeah.
And with the split screen thing, you can actually, on your browser, your laptop or whatever, next to your computer, it'll show you, to the left is this, to the right is this, down is this, and it'll kind of give you background on where you are and some general information, tell you who else is logged into the thing.
Well, thanks so much. I'm really glad to hear that you're getting some value out of that. That was a really fun weekend project. It basically, like, the way it works is that it's like a kind of a smart proxy that sits between the Elko server and the server that transmutes to the to the 8-bit Neohabitat or original Habitat protocol. And there are a lot of really cool features. The whole thing works over WebSockets, and so any events that happen in world that your client itself receives can in theory also be rendered in the browser. So there's really a lot of opportunity for developing that into even like a full-featured Commodore 64 list a Habitat client in and of its own right. So more or less, if anybody out there feels like getting into just a wild and crazy JavaScript hack, that is, I think, one of the more fun projects you can get yourself into.
Yeah, and it's cool to see it work too, because when you're on the 64 and you change the area that you're in, the laptop, my Mac next to it updates automatically, like that, to reflect what's happening in the next room that you're in now.
Exactly. Like that was really one of the things we wanted to make happen, because I know, like, myself is like, Stu and Nate and I were all working on the geography of the world. I just found myself getting lost like crazy. I was like, man, like, I'm one of like the one of the lead devs of this thing, and I'm getting myself lost. I can't even imagine what the other apps are going through. And so, building this docent was really cool, and I really hope that we can continue to expand. It'd be really great to have like a full world map you could kind of check out, Second Life style. We have all the capacity to do that. It's just kind of a matter of free time for hacking.
Yeah, right. I still like to think that somewhere on some server in AOL's basement, there's a version of me lost in the sewers in Club Carib.
Well, what's cool is that that was actually one of the features we were able to bring back in, and my goodness gracious, I remember I went down there without a flashlight, and I'd use my Oracle powers to get out. It was dangerous.
Yeah, it's impossible. And Fujitsu also has something to do with this, because their name is in the splash screen.
Yes, indeed. They were extremely kind in giving us like pretty much like a royalty-free license to kind of go and develop this without any legal issues. And I think really it's kind of serving as the beacon as to like what a motivated group of people who really want to see something come back can do when working together. And it's my hope that that can really establish a precedent for other projects that are in the same state as Habitat.
Yeah, definitely. This is
we definitely should do a round table and panel and talk to people on a live show and have the questions come in. And by then, hopefully, AJ taught me how this Neohabitat thing works.
When we do the walkthrough video that will accompany this, you're going to have to be on there, because if it's just me walking around in in world, that's going to be real boring for 15-20 minutes or however long it is. So
I'm the entertaining part.
Yeah,
then.
exactly.
Okay.
I really think that when Habitat really comes alive, when there are a lot of different apps walking around and bumping into one another, just because it's such like an eclectic group of people who do this. So yeah, that's that's more or less the gist of it. I'm really excited that y'all are going to go check it out and see what's in there.
And it still has the however many avatars per screen limit, where if you go over a certain amount, you have to be invisible.
Right. So if it's over 6 avatars, you have to become a ghost. And ghosts can receive all the stuff that's happening. It's kind of like a primitive form of multicast, but they cannot actually interact until they corporate, and that happens by pressing the F1 key.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's a little eye in the corner of the screen, and that tells you that that either you're invisible or you're ghosting or someone else is. Because that's one of the things that people used to do. From what I've read in the early Habitat, is that they would ghost themselves so they're invisible, and they'd wait around until you put something down, and then they'd become corporeal, grab it, and disappear again.
Yep. So that was when you drop something on the ground in Habitat, it effectively becomes fair game for anyone. And so that's one of the reasons why turfs were so popular, because people couldn't pick stuff up off of the floor of your turf. But in the early days, both people could yank stuff out of the hands of avatars, and they also could shoot weapons wherever they wanted. And this just created like some serious like neuromancery kind of pandemonium. It was fantastic.
Yeah, there's lots of stories about the early days of Habitat and how things just sort of got out of control quick, because people would figure out here's something that I could do to mess with people, or here's something that I could do to max out the amount of money that I had or something, and they would just abuse it until someone had to come in and be like, yeah, no, we're going to change things now.
And some kind of cheating.
Yeah. Well, not cheating, because it was fair game. You were allowed to do it, but then you realize that this is a really terrible idea. Let's fix this.
And I think in a lot of ways, Habitat was one of the very first petri dishes for exploring like how people, in a social aspect on a computerized network, could interact both in positive and also negative ways. And the white paper, the Lessons of Lucasfilm's Habitat, is just a really fascinating read, because like just like you were mentioning, like there were all these things that happened in world. Like for instance, there was this time when Randy built this quest called the Denalsi Island quest, and it was this extremely elaborate thing. It took months to develop all the resources, and they expected it to last at least a couple of months of in-world time. It got solved in something like a matter of like a day, and they were like, "Oh no, what happened?" But it's just fascinating, just kind of these compounding effects you see when people get into these kinds of environments. And Habitat was very much the OG in kind of showing folks like, I think a lot of what we see now on social media networks, and admittedly a slightly more innocent time, if you will.
Well, I'm totally fascinated by all these stories and all the things that I missed.
Yeah, as a European, he did not get any of this stuff, and it's so unusual, at least from my perspective here, because usually he's talking about stuff that is European, because with the 64, a lot of the big stuff that happened was in Europe, and us poor schmuck Americans, we got nothing, or we just got we got the hand-me-downs, the games that weren't quite fixed but ran good enough, stuff like that, and this is like one of those things where I know what this is. I played with this stuff. He has no idea what I'm talking about. This is not something that Europe ever got to experience, which is kind of a shame, because you think maybe Europe, because Europe kept the 64 going long after the US kind of walked away from it.
Very much so.
2 years more.
Right,
so,
and they were even selling, I think the last year that the 64 was
96.
made. Yeah, they still sold almost 1 million of them, because Europe wasn't
not a million. No, not a million.
800,000.
Yeah,
almost 1 million. I said.
So UK and Germany produced the 64 2 years longer.
Right.
So Commodore closed, and I think it was April '94.
Yes.
And UK and Germany had still some financial backup, and they still produced it for two more years.
Right.
And
Europeans were happy with that because I guess their idea of what you do with a computer was sort of different from the US. We were kind of more got to get the newest, shiniest thing. Whereas Europe, it's more, if it works, it works. This is a tested machine that's been around forever and has a huge software library, so keep it going.
I can tell you exactly how it was. Ascom took over Commodore. And went bankrupt itself in '96. But before they went bankrupt in '96, they sold Commodore 64 as video game machines.
Yeah, right.
For 100 German marks.
Mm-hmm.
So in '95 and '96, you could go to an electronics store and just get one as a gaming machine.
Yeah.
But the problem is, those were not newly produced C64 parts, but old parts.
Right.
So that means the expansion port, for example, was too wide because the PCB wasn't exact fit.
Right.
So and the first one my grandfather got actually didn't run any software. It would just say run and nothing ever happened. So after the third try, he said, "Oh, crap! I will not return it a third time." He just removed the PCB portion that was too much to make the expansion port work again. So those late C64s had a pretty bad quality because they just put together what they had left over, and most of that stuff was broken, unfortunately.
My point, however, was that in the U.S., Q-Link went under in '92.
I think it was 93.
93, okay. Q-Link went under in 93. They were already, when I was using it, which was, I want to say late 91, maybe early 92, they were already starting to reallocate resources to AOL. I think I was one of the very last uploads to AOL, or to Q-Link. Before they turned off, you could still download stuff, but nothing new was being uploaded. And, a lot of the message boards and the special interest groups and stuff, they were getting shut down. So the system was still around, but they were starting to shutter it as early as 91. And then they killed it all in 93. And the point I was going to make was, if Europe had had access to this stuff, who knows how much longer it could have gone, because there was such a higher amount of 64 users in Europe and around the rest of the world than there was in the U.S. And it wasn't like Q-Link was ever barren. Every time I would go on there were always people on the thing.
Well, Europe has a different history. For example, in '98, when Germany was united again, people from the East suddenly had access to
98? No, that was 89.
Sorry, 89. Yeah.
You call yourself German.
Yeah, right. No, I was just switching the numbers because in German we say the other way around, actually. Yeah. So anyway, 89 Germany was united, and also a little bit later Poland was independent from the Soviet Union, and so though the Commodore 64 had a revival in Europe because of that.
Right.
But that maybe had a play in it. Yeah.
I definitely think, the Quantum Company and America Online, they certainly did not make many entrees into Europe for quite some time, and that was kind of a bummer. I mean, maybe in like the 80s, like they were concerned about the logistics of opening up a data center, but the Commodore 64 was for at least some time, like truly the de facto computer of Europe, more or less. I mean, the ZX Spectrum kind of had some inroads, and the BBC Micro and a couple of other machines, but the C64 was dominant. They could have really reaped some serious profits out there.
Mm-hmm. And there was nothing like Q-Link for the Spectrum or for anything else. That was really aside from even Habitat being one of the first MMOs, MMORPGs, Q-Link was one of the first online systems that was like that walled garden AOL model.
Absolutely.
That Apple is trying to do so badly now.
Yeah, and what was interesting was that a big investment from Apple with them trying to create something called AppleLink was one of the major impetuses for Quantumlink to become America Online, because more or less they contracted Quantum to build the service, and then they're like, we don't really want it, but you can keep all the IP, and so it's effectively just kind of like a Kickstarter-esque kind of several $1 million investment into Quantum with no consequences. Very late 80s Apple. Very classic late 80s Apple.
And if I remember right, they wanted to charge people some exorbitant amount of money to even use the thing.
Yeah, which also so on brand for them. I think one of like the things that made the Commodore such a great machine was that ordinary folks could get access to some truly extraordinary compute capacity for the time. And a lot of folks like myself, I was a middle class kid growing up. I would have never had access to an Apple computer, but like a Commodore was something like my folks could buy and really use to like expose like the family to something that otherwise would have been really not financially feasible. So I don't know. Apple in the 80s under the Gasset and Scully leadership was a very unique beast indeed.
Impress the kids with the colorful world of 16 colors.
It's true.
Yeah.
I was impressed.
They were a good 16 colors. They made good choices.
Absolutely.
Indeed, they did. Yeah. As we nowadays know, you can with iFly you can make them 64 colors.
Well, yeah. Well, you can. You could do that without IFLI. You can do that in BASIC just by swapping two colors back and forth. But
right.
It's not really making new colors. It's just.
Well, the impression counts, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It
also depended on what monitor you used, because some would totally show that off, and some would.
With iFly, it works on all monitors. It just flickers a bit.
Well, yeah, flicker. Yeah. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
With some monitors, you don't see the flicker as bad as you do others.
That's true. Yeah. Right. So what we need is Neohabitat reloaded for a modern graphic. No, we don't need that. Okay.
No.
I mean,
they kind of that was you mentioned early on in the podcast. What was it?
Worlds Away.
Yes, Worlds Away, which pretty much was Habitat ported to newer systems.
Very much so, and the original team of Randy and Chip was directly involved in the creation of Worlds Away. So there was a direct lineage between Habitat and that. And what I think was interesting about Worlds Away was that it also had a very substantial legacy. It was operating well into the 2000s. There was an effort to reestablish it about a year or two ago, but that kind of went by the wayside. There's also something called the V-Zones project that is also kind of in that same vein. So it would be interesting to see like what can happen kind of as a consequence of Habitat coming back to see like if Worlds Away could come back as well to kind of show people like the full evolution.
Yeah, or even make a version of Worlds Away that'll work with Habitat, so you can kind of
jump over.
Yeah.
I mean, what would be really cool, like I think it'd be cool to like have like a mobile client for Habitat. That's certainly something I've been plugging away with, a little bit in my spare time, because the sort of like touch interface of a mobile device is I think fairly well suited towards the interface of Habitat itself.
That would be, yeah. Yeah, I agree. That would be really good, because the interface does take a little bit of getting used to. It's essentially it's scum, but instead of clicking and then selecting what you're doing, you're clicking and then you move your joystick in the direction, and like up is go and down is do and left is something, and every time I do it, I go through all of them before I find what I'm looking for.
I still do that. You know what's notable is that that actually is the very first documented example of a pie menu in a video game. That was the very first. Admittedly, I still like go through all 4 directions. I'm like, I want to put something, and I inevitably get and then goes ding ding ding, and I'm like, oh dang it, I should know better.
Yeah.
Well, some things you cannot put off. Yeah.
So Steve, where can people find out about this? What's the website or where they can go and what they can download?
Yes, indeed. So if folks want to check out Neohabitat, they can go visit our website, neohabitat.org, and there's a full set of instructions on how to download the client and how to get involved. It usually takes under 5 minutes for anybody on Windows, Mac, or Linux. So, it's a very straightforward thing as long as you download the client. And if you have any questions, you can always join our Slack at slack.neohabitat.org. It'll send you a little invite. And we've got a neat little community out there. A lot of, sort of like VPs and C-levels from companies, a lot of interesting people from Lucasfilm, just a really eclectic and very awesome community of people who've all come to check out Habitat. And
there's also a download link for the D64 file for actual 64 that you can hook up, and instructions for different Wi-Fi modems, how to... Well, actually, I think there's instructions for one Wi-Fi modem right now, but... I was actually thinking about writing instructions for the other 2 because I've got them all.
Absolutely, that'd be great, and that's really one thing to note. Neohabitat's an open source project, so anybody who wants to come and contribute, we are extremely welcoming of that. So many interesting things to get into, so many cool little projects. We even have like a little bot framework written entirely in JavaScript using promises. So if you happen to be like a web developer or something, like there's a lot of opportunities there. If you're into like low-level Commodore development, there's something for you there too. So it's really just like, it's really a free-for-all of open source contribution, and anybody's welcome to come check it out and join.
And there's 2 bots in games currently. There's the Eliza bot, and there's one in the Welcome Center, I think.
Yeah, so the Welcome bot is designed to help ease people into Habitat, whereas Eliza is just kind of meant to provide a neat little like bot foil using the Eliza algorithm in a JavaScript library. And so we have a lot of other interesting bots hanging around in that repo, and it's very trivial to spin one up. It shouldn't take more than half an hour to really get one in world. And so our hope is like, for those who like to do web development or have a background in JavaScript, this can provide a very easy mechanism for hacking on Habitat.
So I have to say I learned a lot today, and I definitely have to check it out. Despite I'm European,
yes,
and I actually have a modified Commodore 64 that I turned into NTSC because there is a clock time clock generator I see that overrides the Quartz algorithm. So yeah, wow. This was very interesting. Oh my God. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, but we will put links in the podcast description to everything that we've talked about and everything that they can go to in the description below so that everyone can check that out. Well, thanks
awesome.
For,
well, y'all have a fantastic day.
Thank you. We will.
Yeah,
thanks for sitting with us.
No problem. Thank you for your time.
Okay. Bye-bye.